Understanding urllib. Today we'll discuss urllib, the request module, error, parse, and the robot parser. urllib is a package with Python that has modules that help work with URLs, uniform resource locators. It has these four modules: request, error, parse, and robot parser. Request opens and reads URLs. Error has the exceptions raised by request. Parse parses URLs, and robot parser parses the robots.txt files. Request has functions and classes for opening URLs and has facilities for authentication, redirection, and cookies as well. Let's understand some of its important functions. urlopen opens a URL. This URL can be a string or a request object. This function returns an object. Install opener and build opener install and return an opener director instance. Path name to URL and URL to path name alternate between the path name and the path component of a URL. getProxies is a helper function that returns a dictionary of scheme to the proxy server URL mappings. This module also has essential classes like request, opener director, HTTP password manager, HTTP handler, and the FTP handler. The error module raises these exceptions. URL error for when the handlers run into a problem. This is a subclass of OS error. HTTP error is an exception and can also serve to be a non-exceptional file-like return value. And content too short error happens when the URL retrieve function detects that less data has been downloaded than expected. The parse module breaks URLs into components and joins them back. It also helps convert a relative URL into an absolute URL, but mainly it has two kinds of functions: parsing and quoting functions. urlparse parses a URL to extract 6 components for a named tuple: scheme, netlock, path, parameters, query, and the fragment. ParseQS parses a given query string and returns the data as a dictionary. And ParseQSL parses a query string where the data is returned as a list of name-value pairs. Unparse uses a tuple generated by urlparse and constructs a URL from it. And urlsplit is like urlparse, except it does not split the parameters. urlunsplit combines a base URL with another URL and constructs a full URL. urljoin joins components to form a URL, and urldefrag removes the fragment identifier from the URL, returns it separately, and also returns the modified URL this way. URL quoting means taking program data and quoting special characters while properly encoding the non-ASCII text. This is to make the data safe for use as components of a URL. Quote replaces special characters in a string. Quote plus also replaces spaces by plus signs. Quote from bytes works on a bytes object, not a string. Now unquote replaces the %XX escapes by whatever character they are equivalent to. Unquote plus also replaces plus signs by spaces. And unquote to bytes replaces the escapes by whatever single octet they are equivalent to and returns a bytes object. URL encode takes a mapping object or a sequence of 2-element tuples to a %encoded ASCII text string. And the robot parser module has the class robot file parser, which tells us whether a user agent can fetch a URL with the robots.txt file. Robots.txt is the robot's exclusion standard or protocol. It determines whether and which pages a web crawler or robot may crawl. setURL sets a URL that refers to a robots.txt file. Read reads the file and feeds it to the parser. Parse parses the lines argument. And canFetch lets us know whether a user agent is allowed to fetch it. mtime gets us the robots.txt file, and crawl delay gets us the value of the crawl delay parameter. Request rate gets us the value of the request rate parameter from the file. Now we're aware of what it means to handle URLs. Let's try doing it.